Hello viewers, welcome to Kids Auto and Truck Repair. Today we have a 2015 Kia Soul with a 1.6 liter. The complaint on this vehicle is the check engine light remains on the dash while the engine is running. The customer also stated that the engine shakes under the hood while the engine is running. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go in the vehicle and confirm the customer's complaint. After confirming the customer's complaint, we're gonna connect a scan tool to the vehicle to see what kind of trouble codes we have in the engine computer. So now let's go in the vehicle and confirm the complaint. So as you can hear, the engine is running and the check engine light remained on the dash. So right there, as you can see, the check engine light is flashing and the engine is shaking tremendously. I don't know if the camera is going to be able to pick this up. The engine is shaking really badly. The whole car is shaking. This is really bad. So since the check engine light is flashing and the vehicle is shaking very badly, this feels like a severe misfire on one of the cylinders. So now I'm going to turn off the engine. I'm going to turn the key on. I'm going to get the scan tool connected to the vehicle. After I get the scan tool connected to the vehicle, I will bring you guys back up so we can scan the engine computer. I got the scan tool connected to the vehicle. Now I'm going to bring it up. So let's scan the engine computer and see what we got. The scan tool has identified the vehicle. Everything looks good. We're going to click OK. We're going to do a code scan. Let's scan all the control units on the vehicle and see what we got. We have 3 trouble codes in the engine computer. The first trouble code is P0300 and it says random multiple cylinder misfire detected. So based on how the engine was shaking, I knew that we had misfire codes. And then the second one is P0304 cylinder 4 misfire detected. And then the third one is P0302, cylinder 2 misfire detected. Now, cylinder 4 and cylinder 2 are companion cylinders. So one cylinder misfiring is going to affect the other one. Okay? Now, a misfire can be caused by several things. A misfire can be caused by lack of fuel in the cylinder, lack of air in the cylinder, or a mechanical problem in a specific cylinder. Now what we're going to do is I am going to scroll down and see what other trouble codes we have in the other control units before we focus on these codes. And these codes are what's causing the check engine light to flash on the dash. So let's see what else we got. We got a CAN fault in the ABS control unit. CAN transmission not matched. Interesting. We have a battery low voltage on the airbag control unit. And then we have the same codes on the generic side of the tool. Okay. Now, what we're going to do now is I want to go into the engine computer and I want to look at some misfire counters. Let's see if cylinder 4 and cylinder 2 are actually misfiring. Let's verify that. So we're going to go to misfire data. So we're going to customize this list. I'm just interested in my misfire counters. Now we could also look at fuel trim numbers to know what type of misfires we have. I know fuel trim numbers can sometimes give you an indication of what type of misfire you have. So we could look at that too. So we're going to grab misfire current. So misfire count 1, 3, 2, and 4. All right, so that's all I want to look at. We're going to focus on these data pads up here. So So now I'm going to start the engine. Let's see what happens. There's one count on cylinder 2, and then cylinder 4. Cylinder 4 has 80 count and then 2, but the other cylinders have 0. Okay, so cylinder 4, it looks like 4 is the one that has a lot of counts. Yeah, this thing is shaking right now. I don't want to run it for too long because we could potentially damage the catalytic converter. So these numbers just disappeared. So the number we had over here went down to 0. And now we have 1 count on cylinder 3. Yeah, so this is definitely random. It's a random multiple cylinder misfire, but we're going to focus on cylinder 2 and cylinder 4. So I'm going to turn off the engine. We're going to keep the key on. Let's back out. So now, how do you tackle this? Because this could just be caused by worn out spark plugs, okay? Like I said, I don't know if I mentioned this. So a misfire can be caused by either lack of fuel or lack of spark. Since this is a gas engine, lack of spark in a specific cylinder can cause a misfire or a compression problem. Those are the main 3 things that cause a misfire on an engine. So let's back out. Now I want to look at, let's look at some fuel data. Let's look at some fuel trim numbers. Because if we have high positive numbers, that can be a fuel misfire. Okay, if we have high positive numbers at idle on a short term, that can be an indication of lack of fuel. But if we have high negative numbers, that can be an indication of lack of spark or not enough spark or weak spark in the cylinder. And that will be an indication of worn out spark plugs. Let's see if we got some long-term and short-term fuel trim data PIDs. Interesting. This is odd. Let's look at ignition data. Let's see what we got there. No fuel trim. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna have to go to the generic side of the tool because it's easier there. This OE side of the tool can be confusing sometimes. As you can see, we have our trouble codes right here. So let's back out. Now let's go to the generic side of the tool. We're going to look at our short-term and long-term fuel trim numbers. So we are in open loop. Yeah, this engine is shaking like crazy. Open loop fault. So our long-term fuel trim was 5.5%. I don't know if you can see the camera shaking. The whole car is shaking like crazy. So it's stuck in open loop driving. This car won't even go into closed loop. So let me pump the brakes. Let's see if we can get these O2 sensors to move. I mean, right now the computer is not even looking at the data of the O2 sensors. I mean, the computer is not using the data from the O2 sensors. It's ignoring it right now because it's in open loop driving. Interesting. So we won't even be able to analyze our short-term and long-term fuel trim data PIDs. Okay, so let's back out. We have to change directions. I'm going to turn off the engine. Since we have misfire codes in the engine computer and the engine is shaking badly while it's running, what I like to do when I tackle misfire codes is I like to check for spark, fuel, and compression. And we need these 3 things for an engine to run properly. Now, I'm gonna start by checking compression first. Let's see if this engine is running well mechanically. Let's make sure that we don't have any mechanical issues on this engine. What I'm gonna do first is we're gonna do a relative compression test. Let's go under the hood and do a relative compression test and see how well this engine is running mechanically. Actually, before we do that, we can actually put this engine in clear flood mode and listen to the way it cranks. We're gonna listen to the engine cadence. Let's see if this engine sounds good. Let's rule out any mechanical issues that we might have, and then we're gonna continue with checking spark and fuel. Let's see if this engine has clear flood mode. I'm gonna step on the accelerator pedal all the way to the floor, and then we're gonna crank the engine. Let's see if it's just gonna crank but not start. And then we're gonna pay attention to how the engine sounds. Let's do that. I'm gonna press the accelerator pedal all the way. Let's get the scan tool out of the way right now. I'm gonna crank the engine. Let's see if we can put this on clear flood mode. Oh, the engine started. It looks like this engine doesn't have clear flood mode, or this computer doesn't have clear flood mode. So let's try that again. No, it's not working. I can hear the throttle open under the hood. I don't know if you heard that. No. Okay, so how are we gonna do this? Now let's go under the hood. I will show you what we're gonna do. Let's remove the engine cover. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to disconnect these ignition coils. I don't want the engine to start when I crank it. Okay? So we're gonna disconnect all of these ignition coils. We're gonna have trouble codes for these ignition circuits, ignition coil circuits in the engine computer, but that's okay. So now we're gonna disconnect this one. Okay, with all the coils being disconnected, the engine is now gonna start. So now, let's grab our scope test lead and connect it to the battery. Our black alligator clamp is gonna go to battery ground, and the yellow alligator clamp is gonna go to battery positive. Okay, so now let's go in the vehicle and see what we got. Let's go to scope multimeter. As you can see, we are reading system voltage on the lab scope screen. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna AC couple this. We're gonna drop our voltage down to 1 volt, and then we're gonna increase our time base to 2 seconds per screen. Now we can crank it. So let's crank the engine and see what we got. So we should see even peaks and valleys across the screen. Perfect. I like what I see, and the engine sounds good. So it sounds like we do not have a mechanical problem with this engine. Okay, as you can see, the voltage drop looks the same across the board. Okay, so all these peaks and valleys are caused by the starter spinning to push the pistons up and down the cylinders. When a cylinder comes into a compression stroke, it causes the starter to draw more current to compress the air inside the cylinder, okay, which causes the voltage to drop even lower. Okay, because when you have a high current draw, the voltage drops even further. Okay, so this over here pretty much gives us an indication of how healthy the engine is mechanically. So this is good. The engine sounds good. We do not have a mechanical problem with this engine. Let's crank it again. Listen. All right, so I like what I see. All these peaks and valleys pretty much look identical. Okay, none of these peaks are actually way lower than the others. So we most likely don't have a mechanical problem with this engine. So now what we're gonna do is let's go under the hood and check our spark plugs and our injectors, because at this point we either have worn out spark plugs or an injector that's not spraying fuel properly in the cylinder, or we could also have a bad ignition coil. So let's go under the hood and do some tests. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to reconnect all these ignition coils. Now we might just have spark plugs that are worn out, but we have to do some tests to be sure that this engine just needs spark plugs. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check these ignition coils. I want to make sure that these coils work properly. So I'm going to disconnect our scope test lead. Now I did look up our engine performance wiring diagram off camera. On the diagram I saw one fuse that sends power to all these ignition coils. And if you look on the wiring over here, you will notice that these coils have a blue wire. They all have a blue wire on the connector. If you see this connector here, there's a blue wire here. There's a blue wire on this coil. There is also a blue wire on this one. And there is also a blue wire on the fourth coil. Okay, so the blue wire is the power supply wire to the coils. And then the wire that has a different color is the control wire coming from the engine computer. Now what we're going to do is we're going to get to the fuse, the ignition coil fuse, and then we're going to connect a loop on the fuse so that we can clamp an amp clamp around it that will allow us to read the amount of current that all these coils are drawing. So if we look at this fuse layout here, you will see that we have over here, it says ignition coil. So ECU, ECU, and then ignition coil. So we're going to remove this fuse over here. So it looks like the 20 amp fuse is this one. So this is our ignition coil fuse. As you can see, it's a 20 amp fuse, so I'm going to remove it. It's a small fuse. So we're going to use this loop over here. I have a 20 amp fuse on it. And then we're going to use our amp clamp and wrap it around this loop over here. Okay, so through this loop we will be able to see how much current all our ignition coils are drawing, and we're going to have current ramps for all these ignition coils on the lab scope screen. I'm going to bring up our lab scope. Let's connect our amp clamp to the lab scope. So we're going to go ahead and set up our lab scope here. So we have to be on the low amp scale. Let's drop our time base to 20 milliseconds. So I didn't zero my amp clamp. We're just going to press and hold this button over here. Okay. So now let's go in the vehicle and start the engine. The engine is running. So now let's go to the lab scope and see what we got. So our pattern is upside down. So we're going to invert it. Let's increase our time base. So as you can see, so our current ramps look the same. So let's trigger this. Okay, so this is pretty much all the ignition coils firing right here. Okay, okay, I like what I see. So this is pretty much all 4 ignition coils firing right here. Okay, so our current ramp looks good, which tells me that our ignition coils are getting good power and good control from the engine computer. We don't have a shorted ignition coil. I believe our problem is just spark plugs. I'm going to turn off the engine, and then we're gonna zoom out of this so we can see all the ramps. So let's turn off the engine. So all I'm doing right now, I want to make sure that actually I didn't pause this. I didn't pause the screen. Let's start the engine again. Let's turn this off. So now we're going to zoom in. We're going to zoom out, I'm sorry. So as you can see, all these current ramps look the same. I don't see a problem with our ignition coils. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to look at the spark plug, because the plug is very easy to get to. Since we had cylinder 2 and cylinder 4 that were misfiring, I am going to remove the plug on cylinder number 4 first. Okay, let's look at the plug. Let's make sure that the plug looks good. If the plug is worn out, we're going to go ahead and replace the plugs. Because we know we don't have a mechanical problem, our coils are good based on the current ramps that we saw on the lab scope screen. Now let's check the plugs. If the plugs are good, the next thing will be checking the injectors to see if our injectors are spraying enough fuel in the cylinders. But since it's easy to get to the plugs, let's check the plugs first. So I'm going to disconnect this ignition coil over here. Let's remove this ignition coil. So here comes our ignition coil. Oh, check this out. Do you see that carbon tracking? You see right here? There's carbon tracking on this ignition coil. This is the problem, guys. You see that right here? This is not supposed to be here. There's carbon tracking on this coil. we have to replace that coil. So let's remove the plug first and see what we got. So here is our spark plug. Our plug is worn out, but it's not really bad. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to reinstall the plug. Let's reinstall the plug. I'm going to move this coil from cylinder 4 to cylinder 3. Let's see if the misfire is going to follow the coil, because I believe the problem is carbon track on this coil. Let's swap this coil around and then erase the trouble codes and start the engine and see what happens. I want to be sure that the problem is just the coil. And then even if it's just the coil, I'm going to recommend replacing the spark plugs as well. I'm not just going to replace the coil. So let's remove this coil. So we're going to get the coil from cylinder 3. We're going to put it on cylinder number 4. And then we're going to grab the coil from cylinder 4 and put it on cylinder 3. Let's see if our misfire is going to follow our coil. All right, let's go in the vehicle and start the engine. So as you can hear, the engine is running. Our scan tool is still connected to the vehicle. Let's see what we got. So we are in the engine computer. Let's look at our codes. Let's back out. Let's clear the codes. No codes present. Let's go to Misfire data. Let's see what cylinder is going to misfire now. Right here. Look at the misfire count. Now cylinder 3 is misfiring. Cylinder 3 is misfiring now. So the problem is the coil. See this? Now if you look at cylinder 4 now, cylinder 4 has got 0 count and 2 has got 0 count, but cylinder 3 has 158 count. Yeah, so our misfire followed the coil. I mean, it's not bad per se, okay, but there's carbon track on the coil itself. So all the energy that the coil is putting out to create the spark on the spark plug is actually being shorted through the cylinder head. So let's go back. Let's see if we have a code in the engine computer now. Now it's cylinder 3. Haha, easy peasy right there. Remember before we didn't have a code for cylinder 3, so our misfire followed the ignition coil. Now cylinder 3 is misfiring. So the problem is the coil, guys. This is easy. We just swapped the coils. The misfire followed the coil on cylinder 3. Cylinder 4 is no longer misfiring, but now cylinder 3 is misfiring because we moved the ignition coil from cylinder 4 to cylinder 3. I'm gonna turn off the engine. I'm gonna order a new coil. We're gonna replace one coil and all the spark plugs. So while I'm here, I might as well just replace all the spark plugs. So I'm going to replace the plugs and one ignition coil, and after that we will be good. Alright, we are back here under the hood. As you guys saw, we moved this coil over here that was on cylinder 4 to cylinder 3, and then the coil that was here, we moved it to cylinder 4. But when we put this coil over here, now cylinder 3 is misfiring, which tells me that this coil over here is bad. Okay, now the coil is not shorted. Okay, we don't have a shorted coil, but the problem we have is there's carbon tracking on the coil itself. Okay, so I don't know if you were able to see that. There's carbon tracking right here. Okay, so we're gonna replace this coil. This coil is bad. We're gonna replace this coil, and then after that we will be good to go. I'm gonna call the parts store and order 1 ignition coil and 4 spark plugs. Once I get all the parts, I'll bring you guys back up so we can install them. About an hour later, our parts have arrived. Here are our spark plugs, and these are OEM level plugs. And here is our ignition coil. So we got our parts from our local Napa store, so we're good to go. Now I want to show you what I have discovered off camera. While I was waiting for the parts to arrive, since I had the lab scope out, I wanted to do some tests on the ignition coils individually. We had already determined that this ignition coil over here is bad, but I wanted to see the voltage signature of this coil and compare it to a non-good coil. Now, we already know that this coil is bad. Basically, what I'm about to do is not really important, but I always like to see the voltage signatures of a bad component and then compare it to a non-good. Okay, so this is kind of just for learning purposes. What I did off camera was I added 1 more channel to our lab scope. Okay, and this is going to be on the voltage scale. I'm going to start the engine, and then we're going to back probe the control wire of the ignition coil. So let's back probe the non-good coil first. Our blue wire is the power feed to the ignition coil, so I'm going to back probe the white wire, which is the control wire. Now we're going to be on, so we are using the second channel. Now I want to show you the voltage waveform first of the coil, and then we're going to also look at the current waveform of each coil. This is a little interesting. So since we are reading primary voltage waveform, so we're going to be on the 100 volt scale. Okay, our time base is 10 milliseconds. So now I'm going to go in the vehicle and start the engine. So we should see primary voltage waveform right now of the coil, and that will give us an indication of how this coil is working, how the secondary of the coil is working. Okay, so we triggered this. As you can see, we have a good pattern on this coil. So coil number 4. Okay, this looks like a nice primary voltage waveform. Okay, we have voltage coming in. Here our coil is turned on. Okay, so this is the dwell time. Over here the transistor turns off the coil, so it stops grounding the coil, so turning on the coil. And then we have this voltage spike over here. This is our spark line. Okay, we have some oscillation afterwards, so this is good. This tells me that our ignition is actually producing enough energy to cause a spark on a spark plug. This is good. So now let's back probe the non-bad, which is this one. Let's see what kind of pattern we have there. So check this out. You see that? Now the engine is misfiring. Look at this. So this is what's happening. You see how bad the spark line got? Okay. Now, let's go back and back probe a non-good one while the engine is misfiring badly. As you can see, the non-good pattern looks good. Look at the engine. The engine is shaking badly here. You see we have a non-good pattern. Now let's go to the bad coil. We're gonna back probe the bad coil. Look at this. Bad ignition coil. Okay. Now I haven't analyzed these ignition waveforms in a little while, so I'm sorry if I'm kind of mumbling here, but yeah, this is clearly really bad. Okay, if we move to this coil over here, check this out. You see, the engine is shaking very badly. It's misfiring, but look at our spark line on that coil over there. Okay, it's good. It didn't change. So this coil is what's causing the engine to misfire very badly. So we have a bad coil. Look at that. Okay, now we can add a channel for our current waveform. So let's check out a non-good first. Okay, look at what we got. Now, one thing I have noticed is there's kind of like a pinto hump on the current waveform. I don't know if you can tell. Let me turn off the voltage waveform. So look at this current waveform. You see this little dip over here? It looks like a pinto hump on an injector. Okay, now what I noticed off camera when I was just playing around with the scope, on the non-bad coil, when you look at the current ramp, this little kind of pinto hump over here, this little dip is not there. There's a straight line over here. There's a straight ramp. So let's clamp our amp clamp around the power wire of the non-bad coil. Okay, so we got this around the non-bad coil. I'm gonna back probe this. So look at this now. You see how we have a straight line over here? Okay, I hope the difference is very, very clear to see. Look how we have a straight line over here. Now I'm gonna move this again. So this is pretty interesting. Let's move this to the non-good. Look at the non-good. You see how there's a little hump over here? There's a little dip. One last time. And this ramp is straight. Okay, so on these gears, if you are analyzing a current ramp of the ignition coil, if you see a straight rise over here on the current ramp, that coil could be bad. There should be a little dip over here. Okay, so check this out. So that's good. Let's turn this off. Let's look at our voltage waveform. Yeah, so 100%. There's no doubt this coil is bad. Okay, so I know we already confirmed that just by swapping the coils around, but I wanted to show you the voltage waveform of this coil. Okay, this is pretty cool, guys. We're not guessing, we're doing tests. Once we replace the coil and the spark plugs, this is going to be fixed. So this coil is very bad. Okay, I'm gonna go in the vehicle and turn off the engine, and after that we're gonna replace that coil and the spark plugs. So we have done our test. We have a bad coil on this engine. So now let's get our tools out of the way, and then we're gonna replace these spark plugs and the ignition coil. So now we're gonna replace these spark plugs. I'm gonna start with cylinder 1 over here. Now removing these ignition coils and spark plugs is very straightforward. I'm gonna undo the coil bolt, and then we're just gonna pull out the coil. So this coil is good, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm trying to see if there's any carbon tracks on this coil. So the coil is good. We're gonna remove the plug. So here's our spark plug. This plug is worn out. So we're gonna install our new plug. I'm gonna try to cruise around and do this really fast because it's getting late over here. So I wanna get out of here and go home. So we got the first plug replaced. Now we're gonna remove the third coil. So this coil over here is the bad one. So bad coil. We're gonna replace the plug, and then we're gonna replace that coil as well. So here's the plug. We're gonna install our brand new spark plug. So here's the part number of the ignition coil. Now we're going to install our brand new coil. Now it doesn't really matter where we put it, because originally it was cylinder 4 that was misfiring. We moved it to cylinder 3. So the misfire followed the coil. So we could put it back on cylinder 4, but I'm just gonna leave it over here on cylinder 3, okay? It doesn't matter. So I opened the tape on the wire when I was doing my test. So I'm going to retape this. So now I'm gonna go in the vehicle and start the engine. So as you can hear, the engine is running. What do you guys think? This vehicle is fixed. So now we're gonna go to the engine computer. This is the code that we had when we swapped the coil on cylinder 4 to cylinder 3. So now I'm gonna back out. Let's clear the fault. Let's read the code again. As you can see, no codes are present. So we're good to go. Let's go to data. Let's look at our Misfire data. None of these cylinders are counting. We got 0, 0 here, 0, 0 here, and the engine sounds a lot better. So this is fixed, guys. Okay, I feel comfortable delivering this to the customer. Okay, no codes present. We're good to go. So now let's turn off the engine so we can wrap up this video. So this is good. This is fixed. I will test drive it in the morning and then deliver it to the customer. We're gonna reinstall the engine cover. So just like that, we're good to go. So now let's wrap up this video. I'm gonna leave this right over here. This Kia Soul is fixed. I hope you liked the video. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like the video, give it a thumb down. But if you do, you gotta tell me why so we can make better videos in the future. If this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell so you can get notified every time I upload a new video. If you're already a subscriber, coming back to watch this video, I appreciate you. If you have any comments, questions, criticism, leave them in the comment box. Thanks for watching. See you next time.